periodic tables. Very excited to introduce our speaker. Just a couple of quick announcements. One is this is going to be our last event until September, so enjoy the rest of your summer. We are accepting cash donations in the front of the bar. One of these days we'll upgrade our technology, or maybe institute a barter system or something. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Klara Klein, who went to medical school at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and also did her residency and fellowship there. She joined the UNC Endocrinology faculty in July of 2022, it's very dark, I can't really see my printout, so I'm just going to tell you that she's an assistant professor, and she did a PhD in cellular and molecular physiology, and she's a clinical trialist who studies diabetes and is doing all kinds of exciting work, and she is going to talk to us about Ozempic and its ilk. So welcome, Dr. Klein.
This may be the first time I've ever used a real microphone, so forgive me if I don't do it right. Thank you guys so much for having me. I think this is just such a wonderful event, and I love that we get to talk about things, science things, medicine things, empower the community to know about what your doctors do. It's really a wonderful event, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm really very informal. So it seems like a really nice, fun crowd. So do not hesitate to interrupt me and ask questions. There's no bad questions. If you ask a question and it's either that I didn't explain it well, or maybe it's something I don't understand, or the field doesn't understand. So I'm here for it all. So I was asked to talk about these revolutionary drugs called glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists. And I use the term Ozempic-like drugs kind of colloquially because that is the drug that really made these kind of mainstream. Everyone, it's a household name. But I'm talking about the class of medications. And they really are amazing, and I'm here to tell you why I reach for these drugs all the time. But there are some serious lows. They're not many, but they are very significant, and I hope that I have timed this right, that we'll have a lot of time to talk about what you guys want to talk about, and we can talk about what the problems with these medications are. As Misha said, I do a lot of work in clinical trials. I don't really, we work with lots of companies. I'm not particular to any of them, but you should know that I do a lot of clinical trials, and we receive research grants or money to do these types of trials to the university. Okay, so what am I going to tell you about today? So I'm going to start by telling you about kind of setting the stage about what's happening in the world with diabetes and obesity. And then I think to understand why we love these drugs, it's most important to understand kind of how they work. And so I'll talk about the mechanism, and that'll be kind of the bulk of the talk. Is how they work, why do we love them? So I'm going to show you evidence, and we can walk through those trials, but there are many, many, many trials that show why they're so great. And then I'll tell you why these things, what are the real problems with these medicines, and hopefully we'll be able to have time to talk about it. And then I can show you, if you want, where you can find the clinical trials that we do at UNC, and that's in the Endocrine, Diabetes, and Obesity Clinical Research Unit at UNC. So, to set the stage, I want to set the stage about me and about diabetes. So, one, I really consider myself a diabetologist. I am trained in endocrinology. I see general endocrine, but I'm increasingly narrowing to really be a person who studies diabetes and treats diabetes. And so I just want to let you know that that's the spin on this talk, is I kind of see things through a diabetologist lens. And so if you had someone who came in who was really a weight management doctor, you might see this presented a little bit differently. These diseases are incredibly interrelated, but that is my disclosure, is that I see things through diabetes. Okay, so I really like this slide. I obviously like rainbows a lot. And what you can see, I think this is from the International Diabetes Federation, and what it shows really well is that there is a huge burden of diabetes in the world. So in 20 years, if I can make my pointer work, in 20 years, in 2045, we expect that the percentage of people who are living with diabetes will increase by about 50% to 784 million people. It's a huge, huge problem. And in North America alone, we expect 25% increase to 63 million people. So diabetes is, this is all I do is I think about diabetes and I treat diabetes. It is incredibly common. So why is this rising? This is really correlating with the rise in obesity. And so here's a figure from the CDC, and you can see that these maps can be kind of overlapped right on top of each other. So this is a distribution of people diagnosed with diabetes and obesity in 2019. Here is obesity, and here is diabetes. And what you can see is that where there's a lot of obesity, there's a lot of diabetes, because these two diseases are incredibly interrelated. So so that's really the background. There's a lot of obesity, there's a lot of diabetes, and these medicines, the GLP-1 receptor agonists, are revolutionary for treating diabetes. And what we've also seen as they've come out is that they are amazing for also treating obesity and weight management. Okay, so to understand how these drugs work, these Ozempic-like drugs, it's important to understand the diseases that they treat. And so I'm going to try and go through this a little bit quickly because I really want to focus on what these drugs do, but I want you to understand what diabetes is, and that helps us understand the mechanism of the way the drugs work. Okay, so diabetes is a disease where people have too much sugar in their blood. So you can see here, this is glucose, which is what I'll slip into saying all the time. It's just a fancy word for sugar. Everyone uses the term. So in anyone who doesn't have diabetes, there's a certain level of glucose that the body should have. The body loves homeostasis, loves your things to be in kind of a tight range. And so there's a certain level of glucose that's in your blood that's considered normal. And when people develop diabetes, they have too much glucose in their blood. So why do we need glucose? Well, glucose is the body's main source of energy. And so, again, this is all very simplified, but imagine that you go and you eat a cupcake. I'm eating a cupcake. It goes in, I eat it, it goes into my belly, and it gets digested into its most basic components, which includes glucose. The glucose gets absorbed into your blood, and then your body can use that as energy. But how does it get from the blood into the cell? How does the body regulate how much sugar is in your blood? And that requires a hormone called insulin. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But the important thing is that when you have glucose, it lets you do interesting things, like give this talk, or go and do weightlifting. It's the most important thing to give you energy, okay? And without it, you can't do these things. So how does glucose get into our cells? So insulin is required. It's a hormone that's released by the pancreas. That's this organ here. And in the pancreas, there are a collection of cells. And if you can squint, there is a little collection of cells called the islets of Langerhans. And it's not highlighted for you if you can't see it. And inside the islet of Langerhans is a type of cell called the beta cell. And the beta cell is the thing that makes insulin. And so when you eat this cupcake, when I eat a cupcake, it goes into my body. It's being absorbed into my blood. My pancreas recognizes that the blood sugar is going up, and it releases insulin so that the glucose can get into our cell. And so in order for you to see how that works, I'm just going to give you an analogy. So this is an analogy of a key and a lock. So insulin is like a key. Its receptor is like a lock. And then the glucose transporter is like a door. So this is a way for the glucose to get into the cell. And the way I would think about this is the door is shut until insulin comes around, okay? And so I'll show this to you. So in normal physiology, so I'm going to tell you again, I ate my cupcake, it got digested, the glucose is in my blood, I'm going to say this a lot, and my body senses that my blood sugar has gone up. And so insulin gets released, and it travels through the bloodstream to whatever cell it's going to, and it binds the insulin receptor. So that key is going into the lock, it unlocks the lock, and it opens this door, and the glucose can enter the cell. And so that is very tightly regulated. The body is very smart in the way that it senses sugar in your blood, and it opens, the insulin is released to very carefully regulate how much glucose is present. And once that glucose gets into the blood, then you can do really interesting things like weightlifting, which I was doing this morning. So can you imagine how this can go wrong? And I'm going to show you the way that I think is the easiest to understand, but really not the topic of the talk. So one way that this can go wrong is in type 1 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is a disease where you attack the beta cells that make insulin. So if you can think about this, you've eaten your cupcake and your blood sugar has gone up. There's lots of sugar in the blood, and unfortunately, there's no insulin to open that door. And so even though there's a cell there that needs that energy, there is no way for the insulin to get, for the sugar to get into that cell. So I have twin 9-year-olds who really love Greek mythology, and so this reminds me very much of Tantalus, where he's always constantly reaching for food, but he can't actually reach it. That's what the cell is like. It's starving, but there's no way, there's all this energy around, but it cannot access that energy. And so what happens, instead of being able to do all this interesting stuff, people actually, when insulin wasn't around, people would starve and die. And so this is a very basic description of what can happen in diabetes. This is the easiest way to understand how sugar can be high in your blood. But this is not what we're talking about. We're really talking about type 2 diabetes. So how else can you think about this going wrong? So if you don't have insulin, you can't get sugar in the blood. What happens if your cells don't respond normally to insulin? Similarly, the cells can't get sugar into their cells. So this is a scenario of type 2 diabetes. Again, very basic. You eat your cupcake, the cupcake goes into your blood sugar has risen. And your body says, oh, your blood sugar has gotten higher. I want that sugar to be able to be utilized, it needs to go into the blood. So it releases insulin, but that cell is not responding normally. It's not opening that door in the right way. It's like the lock got a little sticky or rusty. And so what the body does is it really just tries to overwhelm the system. So the beta cell just puts out more and more insulin, and it can overcome this resistance. But over time, you can get so much insulin resistance that the beta cell stops being able to produce enough insulin in order to compensate. And so there is a threshold, in every individual is different, that the beta cell is not able to compensate anymore. And so I think this is a good way to represent this. You can see here, this is a figure from a mentor of mine from a paper in Lancet, and what you can see is that there is this cutoff, and again, I can't tell you what that cutoff is for an individual, but there is a point where either the insulin resistance gets so much that the beta cell can't make enough insulin for it to overcome, or the beta cell starts to get sick and it doesn't produce enough to bring the sugar down. And at that point, at this kind of inflection point, the sugar in the blood gets to be high, and you develop prediabetes and then type 2 diabetes, okay? So that's kind of a very basic way to understand the development of type 2 diabetes. So now we're getting to the part that you're most interested in, is how does overweight and obesity fit into this? And so where it comes in is, where does insulin resistance come from? So obesity, or the term that we're kind of pushing to use, is something called adiposopathy, but it's so hard to say that it's a mouthful. So, but adiposopathy. So it's abnormal. It's accumulation of fat cells that are making this kind of inflammatory milieu that's causing this insulin resistance. And so what you can say is that as adiposopathy or obesity increases, people get more insulin resistance, and that contributes to the development of type 2 diabetes. And so that's where the vast majority of this increase in diabetes globally is coming from, is the increase in obesity. So you can see here they quoted 40 to 70%, but I think we can all appreciate that, it's probably really much closer to the higher end of that. We have, this is what we deal with every day. And so this is where these medications have been really amazing in terms of treating this disease. So I'm just gonna show you from in a graphical format, what we just talked about. So in general, what happens is, going back to someone who's not living with diabetes, someone who's lean and is considered insulin sensitive. This is a person who eats their cupcake, their blood sugar goes up, they put out insulin because the blood sugar has gone up, and they respond normally. It's kind of a normal level of insulin and a normal response. As people gain weight, they develop insulin resistance, and the beta cell has to respond by putting out more insulin. So there's a bigger response. But at some point, the beta cell starts to fail and people start developing diabetes. And so the question is, how do we stop this from happening? And I'm sure you can put together many different ways that you think about treating this, but we know from a long time that lifestyle modifications and weight loss can really disrupt this pathway. So if we lose weight and stop insulin resistance, then we can potentially reverse the course of diabetes. And the other way that we can do this is by increasing the ability of the beta cell to put out insulin, right? So it's two ways. And this is a vicious cycle, but at the same time, it's kind of a lovely cycle, because if you lose weight, then your beta cells also get a little bit of rest, and they also can start working better too. And so it's, weight loss, less insulin resistance can also help your beta cells be a little bit healthier. And so this is what researchers for a long time have been looking to figure out. And what we have seen is that there's really not been, outside of bariatric surgery, so bariatric surgery is really one of the better treatments for reversal of type 2 diabetes, and you can get 25 to 30% weight loss. We've never had a medication that's been able to get close to bariatric surgery levels of weight loss. And that's changing completely with these medicines. So GLP-1 receptor agonists, again, these Ozempic-like drugs, were developed to improve insulin production. So I'm just going to say that what it really was trying to do was not really to get rid of this insulin resistance. And we were trying to do with GLP-1, and I say we colloquially because I was not involved in the development. But what they were trying to do is to really improve beta cell function because of what they had discovered about what GLP-1 does. And I think that's an important thing to keep in the back of your mind. This weight loss has been really a side effect that's been exploited, which is really amazing. Okay, so as I said, GLP-1 receptor agonists were developed to improve insulin production, and it was incidentally shown to dramatically impact weight. So what does GLP-1 do? In the 70s and 80s, several groups identified that GLP-1, this hormone, was able to go and act on the pancreas and cause glucose-dependent release of insulin. So that portion of this is really important. So if you can imagine, if you're causing insulin release, you really only want it to happen when your blood sugar is high, right? So if your blood sugar is in a normal range and you give insulin, people have low blood sugars. And I'm sure many of you have friends or family that are treated with insulin, and low blood sugar when you're treating people with insulin is a huge problem. It can be really devastating. So to identify a drug that's able to control blood sugars without causing low blood sugars is really a powerful agent. And what GLP-1 does is it's actually released from your intestine and it goes to the pancreas and it causes insulin release, but only when your blood sugars are high. And so many people were looking into this to see if this could be developed as a diabetes drug. So this is my cue to remind you that all of this is about regulating blood sugar. And so what happened afterwards is really kind of a story of serendipity. And I love these types of stories as an MD PhD. These kind of, someone made an observation and then they revolutionized the care of millions of people. It's really amazing. It's what we all hope to do and will never do, but it's a really cool story. So in 1990, there was a researcher who was just really looking for hormones and was interested in this Gila monster because they found that that they had enlarged pancreases, and during periods of fasting, the Gila monster is able to kind of slow its gastric emptying, meaning that it absorbs food slower, so it keeps blood sugar nice and steady. And so he took the venom of the Gila monster and identified Exendin-4 in 1990. And what they found is that Exendin-4 is actually very similar to human GLP-1. But the major difference and the key was that GLP-1, which only lasts in the body for a couple of minutes, Exendin-4 lasts for hours. And so this was the first identification of a way that we could prolong the use of this medication, because you can't really use a drug that's not going to stick around. So they started to look at Exendin-4, and the first drug that was developed, GLP-1 receptor agonist, was an Exendin-4 analog called Byetta, and that was FDA approved in 2005. So these drugs have been around for a long time, and they've just gotten better and better. Okay, so once we started giving GLP-1 receptor agonists to people living with diabetes, what we found is not only does it do things like increase insulin secretion, which it does, it has these other interesting effects. It, in and of itself, reduces insulin resistance. Like the Gila monster, it causes slowing of the gut, so people absorb their food slower. So again, if you have diabetes and you're trying to regulate your blood sugar, if you don't spike so quickly, then it's a little bit easier for your body to be able to respond. And very interestingly, these medicines go and work in the brain and increase satiety, so people are eating less. So you can imagine that as these people, these two things in particular, this gastric emptying and the increase in satiety, really resulted in huge amounts of weight loss. And so that has really been the reason I think that these medicines have become so popular is because there has never been a drug available like this that can really improve people's weight in a way that's meaningful. We have drugs that are available, but we, again, like I said, we see things like 5 to 8%. And so as I'm going to show you later, these drugs are really approaching, the newest drugs are getting very close to bariatric surgery, or the drugs that are being tested. And so this is really amazing. So what does this do in terms of this figure? So again, we love the GLP-1 receptor agonists. When we give them, as expected, the pancreas is able to release more insulin in a glucose-dependent way. So again, blood sugars are getting better with people who are treated with these agents because their pancreas is putting out more insulin, and they're doing it when their blood sugars are high. On top of that, it reduces insulin resistance, so you need less insulin in the first place because your body's able to respond to it better. And then on top of that, people are losing a lot of weight. And so this vicious cycle, again, becomes a lovely cycle because people are losing weight, they're reducing their insulin resistance even more, they're able to respond, their beta cells are producing more insulin, they're getting a little bit of rest as well from all of this stress. And so people do beautifully on these drugs. So as I've said, now I've told you all of the background, and now I can talk about the data, but I'll take a pause because I'm sure I spoke very quickly, but I want to make sure that everyone understood what I said. Any questions? All right, we'll dive into the data, and then you guys can pepper me with questions afterwards. Okay, so this is these are the data that we look at from clinical trials. So this is a sustained study. This is a study that was published in 2017, so before my time in this world, in the diabetes and obesity world. And what you can see, this is semaglutide. So semaglutide is Ozempic, also branded as Wegovy, and we'll talk about that later. So semaglutide is the generic name of it. And what you can see is that people who are living with type 2 diabetes who are treated with semaglutide have dramatic improvements in their hemoglobin A1Cs, which is a measure of their diabetes control. So in general, again, you don't need to remember these things, but hemoglobin A1C of 8% is considered moderate to poor control. When you put these people who are living with diabetes on these medications, at 30 weeks, they've reduced their hemoglobin A1Cs by 1.5% to less than 7%, which is that goal. This is really astounding. And on top of that, they're losing huge amounts of weight. So here, this is, it's important to understand that in clinical trials, the primary outcome is the most important. So this is a study that was looking at diabetes outcomes. So this is the first study of first big study of semaglutide, and the SUSTAIN-1 study. And so I'll show you percentages later, but you can see that people really are reducing they're going from 92 to 87 kilograms, and so they're really reducing their body weight by really a lot. So once these trials are, these companies and scientists are just so brilliant, they're already enrolling for these other studies, and you can see this is the STEP 2 study, which was published in 2021. This is a study that looked at people who are living with type 2 diabetes who have obesity and overweight and obesity, and the primary outcome is a weight outcome. And the important thing to understand here is that people who have diabetes lose less weight than people who have obesity who do not have diabetes. So when we see, we saw here, just so very small, but we saw about 10% weight loss in people treated with higher doses of semaglutide. This is weight loss that we had never seen before in people who had type 2 diabetes. And I'll just show you in semaglutide, so same drug, same dose of drug in people that don't have diabetes, they lose on the order of 16%. Again, I told you that bariatric surgery, we look for 25 to 30%. We've never seen a drug that's been able to achieve this type of weight loss. It is astounding. I didn't tell you before, but at least in diabetes, we think that if we reduce body weight by about 15%, we can really disrupt the core pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes. And you can see that, I'll go back, or I'll show you in a separate slide. We can see people's hemoglobin A1C get into the pre-diabetes and frequently in the non-diabetes range just using these agents, which is really amazing. Okay, so I keep telling you that things are getting better and better. So the next generation of these drugs, so the GLP-1 receptor agonist plus drugs, are even better. And we don't have time to talk about all of the mechanisms of what the other drugs are doing, but I'll just tell you that they activate different receptors as well. So this drug called tirzepatide, it's also known as, the trade names are Mounjaro for diabetes and tirzepatide and Zepbound for overweight and obesity. And what you can see is that tirzepatide, which is a GLP-1 GIP receptor agonist, that these agents reduce body weight in people without diabetes close to 21%. So you can see that these drugs are getting even more powerful. So in the SURMOUNT-2 study, where I was an investigator, published in 2023, when we give tirzepatide to people who have overweight and obesity and type 2 diabetes, again, we're not looking for the same level of weight loss. This improves diabetes control almost to the non-diabetes range, and many people actually do achieve the non-diabetes range. So these are people who have stayed on the treatment, and sometimes it can be hard because there's lots of side effects, which we can talk about later, but 50% of these people have a hemoglobin A1C of less than 5%, which is in the non-diabetes range. We've never had a drug that's like this before. And in this population, again, not expecting as much weight loss for these people, what we saw is that they lost 15% of their body weight. So this is, again, the level of drug that we're looking for to really disrupt the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes. These are revolutionizing the care of people who have diabetes and obesity. But it doesn't end there. These drugs also have amazing impact on end organ disease. So in the first study, and I chose this study, again, there's so many papers that we could put out there. I chose this one. This is for a once daily drug called liraglutide, or also known as Victoza. And I chose this one because my mentor, John Buse, was the head of this study. And again, the details of this are not important, but people who are put on liraglutide have less cardiovascular events and less death than people who are put on placebo. So people living with type 2 diabetes who are at high risk of having cardiovascular events have less cardiovascular events when they're put on these drugs. And again, I want to make sure that we have time so that we can answer all of your questions. But again, this is something we've never really seen before. We've never definitively been able to show that there's a drug that reduces the risk of heart attacks in people who are living with diabetes. Now, I think I said this weeks ago when I gave a similar talk. There's another drug that came out at the very same time that's an oral agent called an SGLT2 inhibitor, and I don't want to not give props to the SGLT2 inhibitors because those are also revolutionary therapies. They don't reduce weight nearly as much. Sometimes, it's not really used as a weight loss drug, although sometimes people will lose weight with SGLT2 inhibitors, and they are not nearly as impactful on diabetes. But these are the first drugs that we've ever really had. You could debate that format, but there really have never been drugs like this. We can definitively say impact macrovascular disease, big vessel disease, heart attacks, and strokes. So this is a huge deal. And it works in people who don't have diabetes as well. So this is a new study that was just published in the last year, a study that we were awaiting the outcomes for many, many years. And we also ran this study in our, or had people in this study in our clinical trials unit. So these are people who have overweight and obesity, who are at high risk for cardiovascular events, so meaning they've had a heart attack or they have chronic kidney disease. And these are, but they don't have diabetes. They were allowed to have prediabetes, but many of them didn't. And what you can see is that people were put on semaglutide, again, that's Ozempic or Wegovy. These people had less heart attacks than people who were put on placebo. This is the first trial that we can definitively say that people who are living with obesity, who come to see us and are at high risk for cardiovascular events, we can put them on a drug, and a diabetes drug or a weight loss drug, and say that it impacts heart attacks and death. And it keeps getting better. So this is, I am very interested in kidney disease. It's one of the things that I study in my personal research. And this FLOW study was just published in the last couple of weeks, which demonstrated that semaglutide, again, this is the Ozempic dosing range of semaglutide. It also prevents cardiovascular events and worsening of kidney disease in people who have diabetes and advanced chronic kidney disease. We've never really seen a drug that's been able to do this in people who have very advanced chronic kidney disease. So again, there's just, I keep waiting for the shoe to drop. These are, every piece of data that seems to come out from these agents is positive in terms of improving morbidity. And it keeps, so I keep telling you it keeps getting better. I'll just say on the side that there are, we are currently doing clinical trials with even more potent agents, and there are drugs that are available that have been shown in preliminary studies to reduce body weight on the order of 25 to 28%. Again, this is bariatric level, surgery level of weight loss, and again, we've never seen this type of weight loss with a drug. So these are incredibly powerful and potent medications, and you can understand why your doctors might want them and why people are coming to their doctors asking for them. So it's a lot of highs, and so I tried to make the lows a little bit less I'm going to try and talk a little bit less so that we can open it up for discussion. But what are the lows? And I think that they are very significant. So the lows, let's start with the first low. So there really are a lot of GI adverse events associated with these drugs. And so it is true, although we who prescribe these medications a lot or work with them in clinical trials have lots of tools to keep people on these drugs. And in general, we are able to get people on GLP-1 receptor agonists and keep them on if we can kind of get them through that initiation and titration period, and we can do all sorts of things. People tend to get used to the GI side effects, but they are not insignificant. People vomit, they have a horrible bloating, they can have diarrhea, they can have constipation. Now, those are the extremes. Most people tolerate these medicines very well, but there are people who are very sensitive to these medicines and can have very bad side effects. And so keeping people on medicines is really important. It doesn't help you if you're not on. And so we have developed lots of ways to get people on these medicines. I think the second thing that I think of in terms of what the biggest issue is that these really are lifelong medicines. So when I talk to my patients or when people talk to their doctors about hypertension, no one expects that it's a chronic disease. No one expects that you're going to put someone on their amlodipine or their Norvac or their losartan, and that you're going to end up taking them off of the medication because it's a chronic disease. You get on it and your blood pressure it's controlled when you stay on that medicine. People tend not to think about obesity or adiposopathy as a chronic disease, but it is. And so when you start treating people, start using drugs for weight management, we have to think about these as lifelong medicines. And the truth is that when we stop these medicines, people rebound very, very quickly. And so I consider it a problem only in that these drugs, as we'll talk about later, are very expensive. And we have so many people who are eligible for these medications, and then we're committing them to lifelong therapy with an anti-obesity agent. The other thing that we talk about and we worry about, and I particularly worry about when I'm treating people who have type 2 diabetes who are older, is that not only are you lose fat mass, right? You lose weight, but at the same time you lose lean muscle mass. And so it does worry me in certain people that if you're losing too much lean muscle mass, that you can become frail, and that is not a good thing either. And so I put that, that weightlifting as a plug for, doing exercise. None of these medicines are replace the importance of exercise and strength training to make sure that you're staying strong. And we don't really know how, most people do fine, but I don't really know in an older population, is the lean muscle mass, is that dangerous? I don't really know, and I worry about it. Problem for me is that everyone wants to be on these drugs, and there's a limited supply. And so I have people that I treat in my clinic who are doing beautifully from a diabetes perspective on their drug. They've lost huge amounts of weight. And because there's a limited supply, I'm sure that you all have heard and know people who have tried to get their drug and they cannot find it anywhere. And so it's really a problem. I have people who I end up having to put back on insulin, taking them off of insulin because they're doing so well, and they have to go back on insulin because their blood sugars are so high because they've had to miss their drug. So this is really a problem. It's devastating for both patients and providers, and I don't know that it's going to get better anytime soon. That said, that's another plug for clinical trials. As long as we have more and more drugs available, then we have more options to treat our patients who need it. And then I think the biggest thing that really is a problem is these drugs are enormously expensive. And so there is it is difficult, and again, this is why it's talked about a lot in the news, is that many insurance companies are not covering these medicines. And it means that people who have diabetes usually can have one of these medicines covered. But if you have overweight or obesity and you want to access these medicines, many insurance companies are they're just not covering it at all. And so people who we really know, people at high risk for cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, who we know will significantly benefit from these medications, we can't give them to them because they are unaffordable and insurance isn't going to cover them. And I'll just say, I see both sides. I don't want to be the person as a doctor who chooses who gets these medicines. And the insurance companies, they don't really choose who anyone who meets the FDA package label can be prescribed the medicine. And it's just, so they can't really, or they haven't chosen to determine which slice of the pie gets the drug. And so in terms of weight management, they just say, we don't cover these drugs at all for weight management, so no one can get them. And it really is devastating for us who want to, my goal in life is always to help people, and I want to make people's lives better and have them live longer, but live longer with quality. And people who come to see me who have, we can't get these drugs for a lot of our patients, and that is devastating. So the last thing I'll say, I'll just put this in here just so that you guys understand what we think about in the clinic when people come and see us, is there's a number of these drugs and there's a lot of confusion about what drugs we can get. And the truth is, because of the cost and what the insurance, I can't tell the insurance company what to do, although sometimes I try to write letters and yell at them and try and get them to do what I want, but they often don't listen. And so how do I choose the drugs? I try to choose a drug that I think is going to best help the person that's sitting in front of me. What data do I have? What comorbidities do they have? What data do I have associated with that comorbidity? But the truth is, I'll just take whatever I can get. So just so that when you go out and talk about these drugs with people that you went to go listen to this talk and now you know everything about GLP-1 receptor agonists, when they ask, you can say, you can differentiate between these drugs. So Trulicity is a drug called dulaglutide. It's a once weekly injection, and we tend not to use it for weight loss. It's not as good for weight loss. It's a great medicine for diabetes. So I might turn to Trulicity in someone that I don't really, I'm treating for diabetes, but I don't really want them to lose a lot of weight. Victoza, as I told you, is liraglutide. When it's marketed for diabetes, so 1.2 or 1.8 milligrams, it's Victoza. Same exact drug, but marketed for obesity at higher doses, is called Saxenda. So they're the same drug, just different dosing. Semaglutide, which is Ozempic, which is everyone's favorite, mine too. I really don't have a favorite, but it's it's the one with the most currently the most data for outcomes like cardiovascular disease. So it's the one that's really been studied the most at this point. What you can see is that semaglutide at 0.5, 1, and 2 milligrams, marketed for diabetes, is Ozempic. Ribelsis is oral semaglutide, it's 7 and 14 milligrams, and Wegovy is 2.4 milligrams of semaglutide. Same drug, marketed as a different name for a different indication. Obesity, and these are for diabetes. Mounjaro, another one of my, really they're all my favorites, but another one of my favorites, a once weekly medication. Tirzepatide, this truly is the exact same drug. 2.5, 5, 7.5, 10, 12.5, and 15, all the same drug. When it's marketed for diabetes, it's Mounjaro. When it's marketed for obesity, it's Zepbound. And so if you come to see me for weight management, and I think that your insurance is going to cover weight management, then I'll prescribe tirzepatide as Zepbound. And if you have diabetes, then I'll likely prescribe Mounjaro. Same exact drug, just different names. So that's how I think about the GLP-1s when you come to see me in clinic. And then there are other kind of older agents that I didn't bring up, but like I said, I'll take whatever your insurance will give you if you're indicated for the drugs. And so that's where I'll leave it. It's a lot of information, but I put it out there so that you guys could tell me what's on your minds. All right, I'm happy to take questions. Okay, yeah.
Going back to the beginning of your speech, how do you tell how far along the way to getting type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So in general, and I should have said this, so I'm glad you asked. It's not easy to tell where people are. So in general, you can measure insulin levels, but we don't do that routinely, and I wouldn't do that in my clinic. So what we typically do is, the recommendation is that people who are living with overweight and obesity is we get a hemoglobin A1C, and the hemoglobin A1C will tell us where you are in the spectrum of how well hemoglobin A1C is as a way to measure your average glucose level. And so pre-diabetes is a hemoglobin A1C between 5.7 and under 6.5, so 6.5 is considered diabetes. And so we look at your labs and see whether or not you might be developing high blood sugars. But there's not a great way, and I don't really know why certain people, some people live with obesity or overweight and obesity their whole lives and don't develop diabetes. And what is that, what makes that person tick, and why someone else who is, lower weight developed diabetes, probably has something to do with, how something about their beta cells, but we don't know the answer. And so it's not easy to really tell where you are on the spectrum without doing tests that I'm not sure that we exactly know how to interpret or are really laborious. So you can do things like Dr. Mattson does in the back. You do glucose plants and we can tell how insulin resistant you are. But really we use these kind of rudimentary ways of just looking at how well you're controlling your diabetes, your blood sugar. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, you.
You gave them all.
So my question is about the availability or the lack of availability.
Yeah.
Given that these have been around for a while and the companies tend to make so much money from them, I'm wondering how they haven't, or why they haven't ramped up and why they're not producing them at higher levels. And I'm wondering if it has anything to do with the fact that insurance companies might not pay for them even if they could produce enough of them.
Yeah, they're trying. Don't quote me on this, but I do think that they're like building a Lilly manufacturing facility in the area. Like, so they are really trying. It's not that they're trying, but it's a peptide, and it's not easy to manufacture, which is what contributes some to the expense. And so it's, again, maybe I'm naive, but I hope it's not that, and I don't think it's that. I mean, they're making, people with diabetes need these, people with overweight and obesity, they need these medications. Everyone knows they need these medications. I think that it's hard to make the medication, it's expensive to make the medications, and it cannot possibly keep up with the demand.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have 3 short questions.
Okay.
So one is, and sorry you already mentioned this, but is type 1 diabetes treated on any of these drugs? Somebody's not gonna know, but then I saw on Google like maybe, so I want to ask the doctor. So that's my first question. My second question is, if there's like a black market for these drugs, and like how are celebrities getting them who don't need them, or like just want to lose a few pounds, like how is that even a thing? Well, maybe you can manufacture, but. And then 3, because I'm a public health person, are like providers counseling also on like lifestyle in addition to prescribing these drugs, or they just like take this drug and like who cares if you exercise, etc.
So I'm going to try and take them one at a time. So one was type 1 diabetes. So great question. So type 1 diabetes, which we could talk about a whole nother talk, can only be treated with insulin. So you have no insulin, it is a life-sustaining medicine, you have to have insulin. Do people who are living with obesity also have type 1 diabetes? Absolutely. So can you use these agents in people who have type 1 diabetes as an adjunctive therapy? Absolutely, and we do, although it is really considered off-label. But it is incredibly important, it will be an incredibly important tool while we're figuring out how to develop different ways to treat type 1 diabetes. There are studies, which you probably saw on Google, that suggest that people early in their diagnosis with type 1 diabetes, that you can give these agents and that they can stay off. And I am largely skeptical of that. That was it's a New England Journal of Medicine report. It's 10 people. I think there are problems there with that study. So maybe it's true, but we need to have much, much, much more data. And the reality is, if you force me to say something, I think it could maybe, if it's true, it could maybe delay the need for insulin. It's not going to stop the need for insulin. So type 1 diabetes, if you take nothing away from this, you have to have insulin. Okay. Question number 2 was about celebrities. Oh, black market. Okay, so yes, there are in the black market, I don't know where, right? There's compounding pharmacies who make these drugs. And the compounding pharmacies, I don't really know how they do it, but I do know people who are using it. I get nervous about using compounding pharmacies, but I do know people who are doing it. I don't really know what the right answer is, and so I will abstain. But yes, they exist and people can get them. 3, how do people get it? So this is the biggest issue with these medications that I didn't put on here, but it is a huge, huge disparities issue. So if you have money and you can prescribe the drug and you can pay for it out of pocket, which is $900 to $1,200 a month, then you can get the drug. You just pay for it. So if someone says, oh, I want to be on Ozempic, and they have a doctor who's prescribing it, if you're not going through insurance, then you can get the drug and you just pay for it out of pocket. And so people, these are now mainstream drugs. People love, they love them, and they should. And there's probably people who are using them that shouldn't be using them. Again, I'm not here to say anyone is doing anything wrong. I want these drugs to be available, and I want my patients who need them the most, who are often people who live with disparities. They cannot get these drugs, and it's really a problem. And so I think addressing the social determinants of health, this just, we have to address all of those things. And so again, I think it's very important that we keep doing clinical trials, find more and more drugs and more competition. We will manufacture them better, it will be cheaper, and we'll have the ability. I do think this problem will be solved, but it may not be solved for a while.
I think she also asked about your patients who take these drugs. How do you counsel them with respect to lifestyle changes?
Again, seeing a doctor is, everyone sees a doctor, or I hope everyone sees a doctor occasionally. It's all about the doctor, right? So it depends on who they are and what relationship you have with them and what is important to them. So do I counsel my patients about lifestyle and about exercise? Absolutely. If I'm being 100% honest, do I counsel my patients as much about diet as my colleagues in weight management? Probably not. Although we talk about it, there's just a difference in what every doctor does and how much time they do. So yes, we should counsel our patients. Does everyone do that? No. And so it's important, I think, again, it's important as a patient population, as a person, to be empowered to understand what's going on. And again, that's why we need to advocate for. There are people who can't know this information, and we have to advocate. So yes, we should do it, and I'm sure not everyone. And it's not. I should say. It's not malignant, right? I mean, everyone is busy. There's a lot of things that that doctors have to cover. There's a lot of burden on physicians. So it's not. I don't want anyone to think that I'm slapping anyone's hands. It's hard to do the right thing with everything. And so, so I'm glad you're here to learn. If you're taking these drugs, exercise.
I have a question about the GI side effects. So in some of these patients, people can have, as pretty severe gastroparesis with severe diabetes. I'm curious if the delayed gastric emptying from Ozempic ever sets them off into a critical state of gastroplegia, if that's a thing.
So again, I think one of the problems with the drug being so popular is that it's in the news about everything. So we use this drug all the time. Many of my patients have gastroparesis. The most extreme patients, maybe I'm a little bit more cautious, but I have not, again, I haven't been haven't been practicing for that long. So I wish you could have my mentors here who've been doing this forever. Sure, there are people who don't, I have not had anyone end up in the hospital because of gastroparesis. Now that's my unique experience. I always tell my patients, we can always try something and we can always stop it, right? So if this is something I think is going to benefit you, we will try it. If I can get it for you, I want to try this for you, but if it doesn't work, if you don't feel good, then we stop it and we do something else. All we're trying to do is to make your life better. And when you come and see me, I'm trying to make it so that your life is better for longer, if that's possible.
I actually have a second question too. A lot of, commonly when patients with diabetes end up in the inpatient world, the first thing that doctors do is stop, metformin or something, right? But now we're in unfamiliar territory where patients come into the ICU and we're holding Ozempic, and potentially for multiple weeks we're holding it. Like, is there any reason not to continue with this?
I think these are, you must be an ICU doctor. I think I can't say that's true or not for any particular patient, right? When someone's coming to see you in the ICU, they're sick as stink, right? Like, I don't want anything that we do on the outpatient side to impact their recovery on the inpatient side, right? So the reality, so there's a big controversy about, I'm sure you deal with anesthesiology a lot. In anesthesiology, there's new recommendations that these drugs should be stopped for a week before people go for surgeries. Now, for a drug that's a week-long medicine and we think has a very, 7-day half-life, if you hold it for a week, the drug is still around. So is that meaningful? I don't really know. So even if you hold it, the drug is still there. And, we hope that most people that are in the ICU with you, although I know that's not the case always, but, the people are going to get better. They're in there quickly and they come out, and then we can restart it. Now, these people that are in the hospital for, a year, for whatever reason, we talk about sometimes putting these people back on their drugs, and it's just hard. Again, these are expensive drugs, and it's a hospital covering the bill for the Ozempic on top of it. It's complicated. So the answer is, in the ICU, I think it's, we don't have any data. Hold it. And then if things get complicated, then we talk about it. But definitely, don't try and get Ozempic on your patients who are going in ICU.
Hi, great talk. I have a question about what the relationship, if there is, between diabetes and pancreatic cancer and the role of insulin in that, and can Ozempic address that? And have we seen an increase in pancreatic cancer as related to the diabetes issue, or type 2 diabetes, that is?
So this is an interesting question, and I'll try and take it in pieces, and maybe I don't know the answer to all of it. I love that you took it in a slightly different spin. So there's been a lot of concern that you're going to be activating the pancreas and beta cell, that you're going to increase pancreatic cancer risk. And that data, we're using GLP-1 receptor agonists. And so that data really has not panned out that there is an increased risk for pancreatic cancer. So the concern has really been, increased risk of pancreatic cancer rather than reducing risk of pancreatic cancer. And it's probably, it's a relatively rare disease. You could, until we have lots and lots of people on these drugs for a long time, we can do observational data looking backward. Right now, the data is looking at whether or not people who've been exposed to these agents have a higher risk of pancreatic cancer, and it doesn't seem to be that is the case, as far as we know. In terms of pancreatic cancer, sometimes diabetes can be the first sign of pancreatic cancer. So we frequently, I will say, I don't know that I've ever seen it, probably because they're not presenting in my clinic, right? They're going to primary care and then they get sicker. But we do think about it, right? If someone's coming in with new onset diabetes and they don't, my other favorite talk to give is, let's classify your diabetes, because there's lots of types of diabetes other than just type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And so, that's one of the things that we think about. Whether or not there has been an increase in pancreatic cancer with a rise of the diabetes epidemic, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure it's been studied, but I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. So I kind of a two-parter. I was curious if there was research on behavior changes of patients on Ozempic, especially as it relates to the dietary choices that they have, since their total nutrition is less. Are they selecting healthier things or like more nutritious things? Similarly, I'm curious with a drug that could be so pervasive that changes people's dietary habits. Are there any projections or research on like economic effects of this drug?
It's such a smart crowd. I love these questions. Okay, so the first question was whether or not there's behavior changes. So again, there's been some worry that these drugs could affect mental health, and so there was an FDA warning that there was a concern for increased risk of suicidal ideation, and that there was a paper published recently in Nature Medicine that suggests that that's actually not the case. And so again, how do we really measure these things? I don't really know. I think there probably these drugs do act on the brain. I think there probably are changes. I don't know that they have been quantified. And again, I see a lot of patients who are on these medicines, and I can't say that anything has come up in my own anecdotal experience. I do think that it is likely being studied, or has been studied, or is going to be studied. These are everyone's looking at these drugs for various reasons. So yes, in terms of the economic impact of changing dietary habits, I can't remember what the document was, but there is like a huge document that is concerned that people's kind of buying habits will impact the the food economy. And I could find it, and if you send me an email, I can forward it to you.
Okay, moderator's privilege. So looking at this slide, these are all subcutaneous injections except Rybelsus.
Correct.
So what's that about? And is that going to change?
Yes. So again, it is hard to get this drug into the bloodstream. Again, it's all about development of the drug. So Rybelsus Rybelsus is an oral semaglutide. The way you take this drug is very specific. You have to take it on an empty stomach with only 4 ounces of water, and that's to maximize absorption. So what person do you know can do that? It's hard. I have had my mentor suggest that you could maybe get it to absorb better if you wake up at 3 a.m. when your stomach is empty and then take it and go back to sleep. And then it can get into your blood a little bit better. But it is hard, it's not as well absorbed. There are oral agents that are being tested that are less restrictive. A Lilly drug called orforglipron is currently in clinical trials. We're running one of the studies at our clinical research unit. And the preliminary data for that is the published data that I think they showed at 2023 American Diabetes Association is a really powerful, it will be a really powerful drug. And so to have an oral agent that people can take at any time will be really important and helpful.
All right, last question.
Brief question.
It's fine, it's great. I'm sorry I talked for so long.
So the first question is data-driven, so probably quick. So thinking about like with gastric bypass, over time, people tend to regain weight.
Give you the microphone, you have to use the microphone.
I will use the microphone. Okay. So over time with gastric bypass, you see people regain weight, and also curious about over long term, even people are adhering to the medication. Things like does gastric slowing, does that attenuate over time? And do we see people regain weight 5-10 years later?
So, these newer agents have not been around that long. In general, people do pretty well. And I think from a diabetes perspective, I think people tend to do pretty well. But yes, I think I think that it is possible that some people will kind of slip and get used to this and then regain weight. We see this happen to some, which is why as we get more and more potent agents, we can potentially switch, and maybe they'll kind of recover. So I think time will tell, but in general, people, at least in my experience, have done pretty well.
My other question is pretty sort of broad. I'm just curious about the implications from your perspective. So we do eating disorder research. Curious about the implications there, particularly if people stop the medication or can't afford it long term. We see people sort of maybe pretty quickly if they stop binge eating, for example. And so thinking about concerns about eating disorder symptoms returning, concerns about anorexia, et cetera.
I am also, I appreciate your concern, and I think it's valid. So yes, I think this is, availability is a huge issue, and I think that people are using it for those, and it's helpful in this type of disease. Again, I don't claim to know anything, but I think in my experience in terms of diabetes and overweight and obesity, that yes, I would expect that the symptoms would return and that it would be a problem. However, it's it's a different disease state. So is it possible? It's hard to think about it this way. I would have to twist my arm to even believe this, but is it possible that you could combine it with with some kind of behavioral modification therapy that you could kind of nip it in the bud, and then and then you could stop it and have people do okay? Sure, it's possible, but I imagine similarly as all of these other things, the drug works. These are chronic diseases, and so these things are gonna return. But I guess my optimistic view is I hope that we'll find a way that we can use these drugs and then do something else so we're not putting people on drugs for the rest of their lives. I just don't know what will happen.
Are there any age or sex effects that you guys consider when giving these drugs, or is it really just about the severity of the types of disease?
So when people come to, I do not consider age or sex. Well, I consider age. Age is, I treat people who are 18 and older, and I think when people are, so when I have, again, you can have a frail 40-year-old and you can have the fittest 85-year-old, that, age is just a number, right? So the person that sits in front of me is the person that I think about. So if I have someone who has type 2 diabetes who is frail, I worry more than someone who is not. So I don't really consider age, I consider the person. In terms of sex, there's no, or gender, I don't think about that in terms of what I do. There are some differences, and you can see that in the data, that some of the trials suggest that there's more weight loss in one gender, but I don't really know whether or not that will pan out in the general population. So if you come to see me, and I think you would benefit from them, it doesn't matter who you are or what age you are. I try to treat the person that's sitting in front of me.
All right, let's thank Dr. Klein one more time. People want to come up. Otherwise, we welcome your donations in the front of the bar, and we will see you in September.